the Empress, I think last time when we were talking about the High Priestess, we were looking at aspects of the feminine that were a little bit more subtle and a little bit more esoteric in nature, kind of getting into that depth of the more divine spiritual principle. And I think that the Empress is a really nice, not necessarily counterpart, but addition to exploring the aspects of the feminine, because with the Empress, we dive into the realm of the Great Mother archetype. And specifically with the Rider-Waite card, we see these images that are bringing to mind the Earth Mother. There's aspects of Aphrodite and Venus and Demeter, the corn goddess, the great Mother Earth that kind of holds and nurtures. So when I read with this card, I'm often tapping into more of these principles of nurturance and abundance and the creative matrix, and also the more sensual, more Venusian side of life, like beauty and sensuality, and the kind of the depths of the aesthetic experience. So the Empress is a little bit more grounded, something that can be a little bit more accessible for us compared to the High Priestess, but also contains her own complexity, some of her dark, shadowy sides as well. So I'll kick it off with that and pass it on to Matt.
Thank you. Yes, I think that Alyssa said it well, that we're moving from some of the more esoteric aspects into where manifestation starts to kind of make the jump to incarnation, to like embodiedness. There's the one of the things I think is interesting about the High Priestess, about the Empress as compared to the High Priestess, we're making a transition where I think this is really where we start to see the human connection to the archetypes. To me, the Empress is less about just where that sort of like mother goddess lives out abstractly, and more how we as individual people start to kind of participate and communicate and make things happen. And so it's really where human creativity lives, where there's a connection to divinity, and there's this and I'm sure we'll get into, there's all these imagery of reproduction and birth and growth and rebirth, but a lot of that is very much about the way those sort of like abstract things that we started to talk about, and with the magician and the High Priestess really start to kind of like filter into like the life that we as human beings lead.
Chris, the Thoth, what do you got?
Motherly love is a bond made of blood, sweat, and tears. In this card, beyond just Venus, one of the really beautiful images is that she, in her body, is showing us salt, the feminine form. And then we've got the pelican, and we've got blood, sweat, and tears. All of this is motherly love.
All right, I'll give some thoughts on the Empress from my perspective. I have more of a kind of zoomed out lens for tarot in general. It dips into sort of my philosophical ideas, but I see the mother as kind of the infinite reservoir of creativity from which everything is born and everything returns, right? So the mother as the womb, sort of the cosmic womb, everything comes out of it, and in some ways everything kind of returns to it. On on a personal level, there's this notion of this kind of unconscious place in the depths. And when we're babies, we're just sort of in that unconsciousness. We're in the mother's arms. We're not conscious yet. And then over time, we slowly kind of leave unconsciousness and are brought more into the realm of the father, which is consciousness. So mother is still that place of unconsciousness, all that creative power, all that depth. There's sort of a kind of eroding energy of the mother, by which I mean the father creates hierarchy and the mother kind of dismantles that hierarchy and kind of smooths things out, levels things down. So you can always be kind of like caught by the warm embrace of the mother, whereas the father is going to kind of push you up and try to turn you into something, into a structure, become, whereas the mother is like, take apart, return to me. It's okay, I will catch you. So that's kind of a very zoomed out pattern I see for the mother. So why don't we move on to symbolism and imagery that we see specifically in these cards, Alyssa? What do we see for the Rider-Waite as far as symbolism, imagery? What does it mean?
Yeah, well, there's a big emphasis on the environment with the Rider-Waite Empress, both in the foreground of getting the wheat or the corn, the lush environment. So it's evoking that sense of the abundance of the earth principle, and the Empress as that personification of the earth, which of course taps you into all of those primordial goddesses. And then you see her as a figure wearing the big gown, sitting in this sort of cozy cushioned chair. You have the heart, or it's like the shield in this iteration with the Venus symbol on it. And so there's this interplay, I think, between the depth of the archetypal principle that's at play with the Empress, of her as the earthly goddess, but there is also how that starts to kind of disseminate down into these more relatable aspects. And to me, she always seems like she's sort of there's this larger than life aspect to her, and her large gown might be insinuating or covering that, like, she's pregnant. I think often we look at a lot of the Empress visuals, especially with the Thoth deck, the kind of holding of the hand that seems like she might even be cradling a child. And so there's this lushness, there's an abundance, the crown of all of the stars, of the royalness, but there's also an ease to her. And I think you don't look at this card and feel the sharp edges like you do with the Emperor, but there's more softness, there's more of that sense of the ease and the holding. And that's what always really strikes me with the Empress Rider-Waite.
I like the way that she is sitting in the Rider-Waite specifically. It's almost as if a woman who's just given birth, like that kind of image of like going through that labor and she's sort of recovering from the labor of birth, like that gown she's wearing, the way she's sitting is very much reminiscent of like that post-birth stage of recovery. And she has that kind of soft smile on her face of like, oh, I did it. What about imagery in the other cards? The shield in the Marseille, Matt, that's pretty, stands out quite a bit, I would say. What is up with the shield?
Yeah, there's a few things about the shield and the imagery that I think are, well, actually, I'm going to start by talking about her throne first. Behind her, there's this, the chair that she has this kind of like, one of the things that's kind of neat about the Marseille is you get these sort of accidental inferences of what something is intended to be and what it evokes are not always the same. And it seems clear that this is intended to be her seat and her throne, but the shape of it is evocative of wings. And we see that that sort of like repeated there in the shield. And there are various interpretations of this, but one thing that kind of, I think, in some ways, the Empress represents freedom, because it represents creativity and genesis and newness. And it also represents the life force in a lot of ways. And specifically to me, it represents the life force as kind of an answer to the destructive or disorganizing force. It's like this kind of like recombining of different elements into something new. And I think that once that, you know, like you can't do anything if you're dead, right? there's absolutely no freedom in death. It's a prison. And by the same token, there's no freedom in non-existence either. So the Empress sort of represents this this counterbalance to that void that can kind of recombine and respark the life. And in that, there's freedom. There's freedom to act. There's freedom to do things. There's freedom to be novel, and to soar like an eagle.
Chris, can you go into depth about the Thoth imagery? It's always a little more to work with. I feel like with Thoth, a little more psychedelic.
Sure. So one of the things that comes to mind with this card is actually an XTC song title, Human Alchemy. I mentioned earlier that she is blood, sweat, and tears. She is making the sign of salt, which is a circle with a line through it. It's the passive element of the alchemical principles, of which we've done two. We did the magician, who's Mercury, now salt, and the third is going to be the emperor, sulfur, and that makes up the alchemical triad. But, you know, sweat and tears are both salty. We know them as salt. And in the symbol of the pelican, which is pecking out its own blood to feed its children, one of the most sublime symbols. And, you know, one might recognize it in a lot of Christian imagery, but it is actually one of the oldest pagan symbols as well. It's a universal symbol. You know, the image of the Grail, the nourishing blood of the Grail. So we get that image of human alchemy, where she takes sweat and blood and tears, the salt of femininity and the blood of femininity, and produces life. So a lot of the symbolism here is that of life. Her clothing is covered in symbols. She has the zodiac, bees, many birds, all of it is life.
I like this idea of especially the bees on her clothes. I was actually listening to something yesterday about bees and was just becoming really fascinated at this idea of like a natural evolution in the animal kingdom of like a matriarchal species, you know, the queen bee. This like life is surrounds her work and everyone is in service to her. And there is this sense also of the procreation of bees, or as they go to collect nectar, they also fertilize the land. And so this interesting symbolism gets you into this kind of dynamic of the feminine as kind of the source, or that genesis point, I think, as Matt put it. And one thing I wanted to discuss with you guys was the idea of the Empress coming first before the emperor. You know, not that tarot is perfectly linear, but it's important for us to look at the progression of the major arcana and watch the development step by step. And the Empress, as that first really grounded, manifest earthly principle, she to me is like how we consider, you know, psyche growing out of the unconscious. You know, ego is born from the unconscious space. Life is generated from the creative matrix of the womb. And to me, the Empress coming first is she holds all of the fertile ground for the creative potential. And then, you know, the emperor can come in and structure it or animate it more as sulfur would, you know, energize it, fire it up. But I'd love to hear any of your guys' thoughts about, you know, the dynamic there.
So one thing that I think shows that perfectly is that bee symbol and that natural matriarchy that cares for the child. And we get that in the myth of Zeus. When Zeus is a baby saved by Rhea, she does not care for him directly. You know, she has to take him away from Kronos to save his life. And he is actually fed of honey. He is fed by bees. Bees keep him alive and nourish him. One of his epithets is actually Melesos, the man of the bees. So the fact that the Empress, you know, and Jung describes the archetype of the Great Mother as the woman of the bees. The fact that she comes before the Great King is not surprising, because they need to be nourished. Like, what do they say? They say, you know, behind every great man, there's a great woman. This is very much that. Also, the only natural liquor in the world, the only liquor that does not require human intervention, is mead. It just happens naturally when bees store honey. So we get, you know, the divine substance arising from the natural feminine.
One thing I think that kind of the lens that I tend to look through is, you know, very, very much influenced by Christian symbolism and imagery. And the sort of like overarching figure of the mother in the Christian story is obviously Mary. But one of the things that I think where that archetype finds a sort of expression in the Empress is there is an idea that, you know, in the story, you know, it's often kind of portrayed as if there's something that just kind of like happens to Mary, like this thing happened and just a miracle happened. But it's very clear that she was approached and had to consent to this kind of strange thing that was going to happen to her, and made sort of an active decision that she was going to be a part of it. And I think, and why I think where this kind of comes in with the Empress is, to me, this is where there's that the growth and the birth that we bring forth into the world. Specifically, like human women bringing forth children, but anybody who's bringing forth anything, it can become elevated when there's a communication and a participation between the higher and the lower, and, you know, a desire to make the world that we see around us more like the world that we see in our minds. That's really, you know, one of the best definitions of magic that I've ever heard is the influence of the subtle on the dense, right? So when we try to maintain a magical operation, we're trying to maneuver and make these dense material of our everyday lives influenced by the subtle material of something more. And it can be as much as an idea, but there's something that's sort of like participatory about that. There's something that's sort of unifying about that. And so to me, this is where partially why the Empress has to come before the Emperor, because she's sort of like, this is, and I think the threes in tarot anywhere is where that that force meets the force of inspiration meets the force of action and embodiment, and then you can do all sorts of cool things with it. But it has to start somewhere, and she is really what is the gate, the opening for all that to process into the world.
Yeah, just kind of reiterating what I said in the intro. I do see the Empress as coming before the Emperor, the same way that unconsciousness comes before consciousness, and just as a general pattern in life and in the universe is kind of a striving upward, a becoming of things that is sort of like a more of a masculine energy of kind of striving higher and higher, or building the structure higher and higher, or the hierarchy, just creating hierarchy in general is sort of a masculine thing. But there's always sort of a going too high and collapsing back down and being caught by sort of the beginning or the origin, which is sort of the mother's arms. So the Empress always, to me, evokes the origin or the beginning from which you build or you set off on your adventure. And then either your adventure ends or you die and you have to collapse back down, and the mother catches you and you're sort of reborn, building back upward. So the Empress seems like the origin point. The Emperor seems kind of more of the striving, and always that cycle of returning back into the mother's arms, returning back to unconsciousness in order to make a second attempt at becoming conscious, or returning literally back to the mother when you're a child, when you're scared, and then your father coaxes you back out to say, try again. But then maybe the father tries too much to coax you and you run back to your mother's arms. And so there's always that kind of returning back to the mother's arms for safety. When you feel safe, maybe you venture out into the land of the father, and then you come back to the mother's arms, et cetera, et cetera. So the order makes sense to me in that way.
There's something also to considering the order up until this point. And I think Matt mentioned this in his intro, but I do feel that the Empress is really the first foray into the dynamics of like the material realm, the kind of like birth point of the Fool, you might say, or like that essence of potential that it was first sort of germinated in the Fool. And then there's this these aspects of the more subtle psyche that I feel like the Magician and the Priestess represent. But once we hit the Empress, there's a shift in sort of energy and feeling and dynamic in the major arcana, because then we move into the mother and the father and society and relationship. But she really is that entrance way into it. She's the gateway. But what came before this, I think, was the building up of awareness and dynamics of psyche that are allowing you to at least be birthed into the world and begin to interact with it. But through, of course, the mother first.
Perfectly described. Crowley actually calls this card the Gate of Heaven. But there, I think I will give a bit of an alternative viewpoint to what I'm hearing about the type of femininity. I think that she is not necessarily the fertile soil. Like, it seems like we're talking a lot about like the great mother, but the great mother is built up of 3 cards rather than any one card. And what is clear, perhaps more clear in Rider and Thoth, is flourishing, blossoming. You know, the central image of Thoth is the lotus that the Empress is carrying. This is not just the dirt of fertility. It is the blossom. It is the creation. It's not just the dark unconscious life, and not just the great mother that one recedes into, but it is that creative love. It is the creation of that through blossoming forms, as opposed to the High Priestess, which might be more along the lines of creating seeds, because she had the seed pods at her feet. Now we are getting fully into the blossoming of those forms. So I would say it's definitely a bit of a demarcated femininity, advancing, progressing, and not so much of a fallback.
Yeah, I like that point. I think it's always hard to capture any full complexity of the archetype in any one tarot, and you kind of see them expressed through so many different ones. But when I consider the Empress as this sort of like epitaph of the Great Mother, and something that can be like worshipped at the altar, I see her in interesting forms as both that kind of nature grain goddess, but also as like the dark, terrible kind of Baba Yaga Kali style as well. And I see that in her, especially when she's reversed. I think that's something that's kind of I've sat with, at least recently, as I've explored more of the archetype of the mother myself. And when doing a reading, it came up reverse, and that's really what came through. And I don't often see people necessarily reading her that way if she's in a reversal. And of course, like other cards might bring out certain qualities, but it's important for us to recognize that the aspects of earth, which are abundant and giving and providing, also take away and are destructive. And there's this kind of neutrality to that, ambivalence to that aspect of the archetype, that just as it provides life, it also takes life away. And I'm curious of how you guys read the card in a more shadowy valence and a more reversal if you read it, or just that more darker nuance of how we see the Empress presenting herself.
I had an instance pretty recently where the Empress came in sort of, I guess I would say, a less dignified manner. So it wasn't like a reversal, because I don't often read with reversals, but similar idea. It was in a challenge kind of point. And in the context of that reading, it seemed to signal that that it was like the gate was closed. Like the person who was trying to the point that was challenged was there was a desire to kind of there was actually a little bit of that desire to return back to the kind of safety that Arran was talking about. But the Empress, as Chris pointed out, is not that kind of is not that. This is the area where new life and birth happen, which are like painful and you know, these are heavy, big things. They're not a retreating into safety. And in this particular context, that was the thing that was sort of like the tension in the Quirian's life, was between this sort of like desire for security and safety running up against this impulse to create and to let something new be born, and know that in that letting go and something new, there's a sense of uncertainty and control that you lose, because now you've given birth to something and it has a life of its own. And that can be a challenge for a lot of people. It can be a challenge in actual human relationships, but it can certainly be a challenge for the life of a creative person when they're trying to even this conversation, we're trying to like have something come out and we don't really know where it's going to go, or what's going to be loosed from it. So there's a certain kind of like courage that needs to happen there. And sometimes I think when that card comes up in a challenged or blocked way, or a reversed way, there's an indication that there's something kind of like holding us back from giving out into the world.
What a great point. Sometimes the gates of heaven close. I think it reminds, I guess this is the way to articulate before what I mean when I mean like this is not the devouring mother that we fall back into. I think that the negative form of the Empress is best described with a psychoanalytic concept of the refrigerator mother, which is when, and this is common, honestly, you know, there are people who they have their child and it's like, well, I did it, you know, that was my end of the deal. Now they have to get taken care of. Now they have to grow up. Like there's a point where there are mothers who do not want to give and have nothing to give. And I think that is the suffering experienced with the negative Empress. So I agree, like when it's an artist, you know, sometimes inspiration is not present and heaven does not want to give you anything. And you will not get inspired. You will not be given kindness, you know, and that I think is really when we need the emperor. That is when we need will rather than love to be able to overcome that lack. So perhaps it is in the negative form of the Empress that we find the need to, you know, act upon the blossom. You know, gardening is, I would say, one of the great masculine arts, oddly enough. You read about Japanese generals who would garden before battle. It was their meditative art. And it is a masculine imposition on natural blossoming. Bonsai, especially, where you need to very, very carefully apply will and logic to get the image that you want out of things. So, you know, natural growth is only able to go so far, but when it fails, when inspiration fails, we need those little, you know, we need scissors and clippers and tools to perfect it.
Yeah, I find this idea really interesting because gardening is this exerting of control over the natural wildness. And when we consider the two principles of like the more active versus the more receptive, or the kind of unconscious versus conscious, the gardening is this manipulation of the natural world. At the same time, I can see how it can be performed and in service to a kind of regeneration, because there's been this overly sort of active control of the earth, and many people who maintain gardens might try to plant you know, wild, more local plants and things like that. We're trying to give like an expression of the earth back because we've taken from it. And I think that's something that we sometimes explore with the nature of Earth's gifts, is that we take and we take and we take and we don't give back, or we don't nurture it. That reciprocal nature that carries things further into balance often goes into that place where it's off. So that manipulation of that natural principle is not something I think a lot of us consider when we look at like the manufactured streets. But what did the earth look like before, you know, we tore down trees and laid down roads? It was there was a wildness, there was a chaoticness to this. And that's what I always kind of love about that. The archetype of the natural earth mother is the wild unknown principle that you can enter in and, you know, pick fruit and food or hunt, but you might also, you know, step on something like a poisonous snake and it'll bite you, or you know, will touch something that gives you a rash. There's just this real powerful ambivalence to it. And how do we as humans interact with something that's so powerful and sort of dances across this huge spectrum? It's almost overwhelming. And so we need to come in with structure. We need to come in with rules. We need to come in with that manipulation for us to feel grounded and empowered. And sometimes being with the Empress is a lot about the release and the letting go into that space that can be so hard for us, especially if we interpret her as creativity. It's like, what is it to be creative? It's to tap into that wild channel, something you can't really fully get your hands on, but you can sort of try to manipulate. So that dance, I think, is at play when we work with it in a more embodied way too.
Just wanted to mention a really quick thing. I don't know if you've all heard Mitski, the artist. She has a song called Nobody, and I think it fit perfectly what you said. You know, Venus, planet of love, was destroyed by global warming. Did its people want too much too? So speaking to that real demand for care and the fulfillment of our desires from Venus, which is the Empress. But that was all.
Makes me think about the demands of the mother or the demands that we put up to figures or guardians in our life to meet these needs, and how difficult that is as one who's either nurturing an actual life form, or the demand that's required of you to nurture a project or a business into life. It takes everything out of you. It's one of the most difficult positions to really take. I don't know, just a thought that came to mind.
A fun prompt that I like with these cards is, how do we see this archetype present in myth or pop culture, whether it's specific characters or figures, or like even scenes or environments or arcs in story? How does the mother manifest, not the mother, excuse me, how does the Empress manifest in fiction?
I'd love to hear some of your thoughts first, Arran. I think you've always pulled on some interesting, especially pop culture examples.
Yeah, I don't have that much actually though for this one. I haven't thought about it enough. I mean, there's the obvious mother figures that are in pop culture, that are in every story, is like the character's mother, the hero's mother, or some sort of mother figure. But I didn't prep enough to really have that much to say. There's like Catelyn and Cersei as sort of light shadow mothers in Game of Thrones. But that's like a little literal and concrete, I would say.
Well, I think, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the Game of Thrones universe, but I think Catelyn even is an interesting example, because you see her fierce protection and love and nurturance of the children, but spoiler, you know, when she's killed, she sort of like morphs into this like dark version of herself that goes around killing people who she thinks were involved in the murder of her family. Like, she embodies this complexity of the archetype in such a dynamic way. And she's also really not perfect. Her relationship with Jon Snow, who she sees as a problem, you know, she can't extend all of that nurturance. You see the kind of the nuance of her humanness, while at the same time being connected to that greater sort of psychic archetypal structure of the mother.
I think Princess Leia is a really perfect example, because even when she needs help, she is not helpless, and is actively, she is the mother of the rebellion. She also kind of fosters the growth of Luke, Han Solo, and everybody. Everybody is growing. She is aiding the Empire, or excuse me, aiding the rebellion. And but she is a product of the Empire. You know, the Emperor, who is not actually the Emperor, but is Darth Vader. You know, they're tied together. They're two opposites. And you get that image of like, what is this overarching male rational force that puts its demands on the universe, versus the rebellion, essentially, you know, trying to gain freedom and creativity that is not stifled by this imperial logic. So you definitely, you know, you get the image of what the Empress would be. You know, if there were an Empress of the Empire, it might be a far more nurturing, free form rather than the presence of, they're always, what do they do? They're always they're blowing up planets. They destroy planets. Whereas, right, the rebellion is always trying to foster development on other planets. So
I love that. The character that kind of came to mind for me, and I think kind of showing two aspects of this, is Sarah Connor from the Terminator series. And I'm only talking about the first two movies because why would we talk about any of that other stuff? But we kind of see, like, I think two sort of aspects of where I think the Empress kind of fits in. In the first movie, Sarah is kind of like, she, for most of that movie, things happen to her. She is sort of like the football that's kind of passed around. And she's, like, the good guy is protecting her and the bad guy's trying to get her, and she's just trying to make sense of it. And sort of gradually, as this whole process is unfolding, she has more and more and more, like, kind of like input into what's going on, and then sort of has a decisive role in how everything shakes out. By the time we meet her in the second movie, she has now morphed to a much more proactive. She has given birth to this savior figure. She has actually, like, accomplished that work, and now she has found this reserve of strength and protectiveness and motivation to then ensure the future. So it's like there's this evolution that happens, and I think both of these things sort of are present in the Empress, where it's the very beginning of and the germination, but then there's also that Chris talked about the flowering, and that process needs to be sort of like defended and protected, and we kind of see that happen with Sarah Connor, I think, pretty well.
Before we get to the top of the hour, I'm wondering how we might describe practicality with this card if we were using it in a reading. When the Empress shows up, what does it really mean to me, like in my life? How do I interpret that? How does it affect the reading? Does it mean sort of return to a sort of more open, chaotic, creative place? Does it reflect someone in your life? When you guys read the Empress, what does it mean to you, and how do you use it?
I would say for me, I'm going to give the most hated answer in the history of anything like this. It depends, but it's always the most accurate one, so that's why we use it. I think a lot of it, with any card, really depends on who is asking the question, why they're asking the question, what's going on in their life. I think, again, sometimes the Empress can be, from a just purely divinatory status, it may, like the classic, you might be having a baby. Like, that really could happen. It's not kind of like my general style of reading, but that certainly is present. But there's often, depending on what the person who is coming to me is dealing with, there is often a place where there is either the thought that something new needs to happen, the beginnings of something need to be sort of like brought in. One thing that I think that the Empress is really, I think, one of the first places where it seems to connect for me to the other cards in both the court and the minor arcana, where I really see a connection between the Empress and all of the threes in the pips and all of the queens. It's like the Empress is sort of like the queen of the queens. And so those the things that are present within those, the qualities that are present within those inform how the queen shows up in a reading with some, or I'm sorry, how the empress shows up in a reading, because it's sort of like, and it depends on what the other cards and what their relationships are. But I think that those things are sort of like present there, and the empress is sort of like the overarching, more abstract, like, representation of these very concrete things. And so it often is a case of like what aspect of those things is present and relevant to the situation. If that makes sense.
Yeah, Matt, you're actually touching on a few points that if we had time, I kind of wanted to pick your guys' brain of like, do you see that relationship between the queens and the empress? Because I think certain schools of thought do draw those parallels, as well as looking at the numerological connections, and that we have a 3 here as a major arcana, and her principles expand into the more kind of grounded, relatable dynamics of the minor arcana. Because for me, the 3s and the minors all play and dance with these themes of creation and expansion, and what's kind of born from elements kind of converging together, and what happens as things start to kind of flow and take shape, and the kind of like triad, which was born from the 1 and the 2. So to me, the empress does evoke those feelings of what is being nurtured, or what's created, or what's expanding, what's trying to come to life. Where is that sense of flow and abundance, or where is there lack of it? And I think at times when it's come up in my life in really powerful ways is when I've been dealing with those kinds of dynamics, both when I was younger and got readings and didn't know anything about tarot. I used to get really freaked out by the empress, because it was like, oh my God, mother, that's pregnancy, right? But like, like think about it in its true essence, especially as you move from like childhood into adulthood, it's like so much is being born from you in these moments. And how do you ease into that archetype to allow for things to continue to nurture and grow? So I'm always considering that when it's coming up. But to Matt's point, it's so important not to get too rigid when you read tarot, and what you asked, how you asked it, and the cards that come out with it all kind of shape the nuance. And that's what's so beautiful about using the cards, is there's so much nuance and complexity to the symbol itself. Its potential is infinite, but you sort of circumambulate this major theme, I think, of the creative, expansive, developmental aspect of the empress.
All of these Jungians, I must read it as a Freudian, and this is honestly the case. It is generally about their mother. I don't give many spiritual readings. Like a lot of the people who I give readings to, it's generally about their life, about relationships. So it's generally their mother, or a major feminine figure that's present. I don't have a super symbolic reading of it. I mean, sometimes in my own, but generally it tends to be that simple.
All right, Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point too. That briefly, that who is giving the reading is a huge part of what that's why it's like we can talk, and this is a great exercise to talk about what is contained, the depth of what these symbols are, but it's not the same thing as what it means. Like, there are certain things that it means to me. It's speaking a certain language to me, and what I'm kind of going on and drawing on, that even though there's a lot of overlap between the material that we're sort of all drawing on, but Chris has kind of got a different symbolic language that it's speaking to than it would be for me or for Alyssa. So a lot of it is really about having that sort of like relationship with whatever the card is.
Yeah, and just to Chris's point, I think that I still like really agree, even though I'm like such a Jungian at heart, and I'll carry that till my death. But the Empress for me in the last, I would say 6 to 8 months, has been all about the mother, like my mother, my relationship to the mother complex in its both archetypal and very grounded form. And it's something that I feel there was a lot of tension and resistance to, but okay, I'm such a Jungian, but it was also in my dreams, right? It's like these dream images. It's all about the mother, the cards coming up. I have to deal with this stuff. So you have to play with like the nuances of both, that there is this very real relationship that has formed you since the moment you were born, since before you were born. And she can come through in her personal and powerful archetypal form. So as I said, +1 for Freud. We got to give him his due here. Jacob has a question. I guess I'll just read it just since I'm unmuted now, but are there any severe misinterpretations that you often find with this card? And he mentions the aspects of the devouring mother. So yeah, that's an interesting question. Any thoughts, you guys, on misinterpreting the Empress or ways you've seen it expressed?
It's very hard for me to say that, kind of like to my earlier point, it's hard for me to say that somebody else's interpretation is a misinterpretation, where I'm sure that happens. I mean, I 100% know that happens, but I feel like it's a little bit difficult to say that an interpretation is wrong unless it's kind of done by a person who's not really a skilled reader yet, I guess, if that makes any sense. I think sometimes there's a tendency to be a little simplistic, and sometimes that's a good thing. It's good to be grounded, especially when we're talking about the Empress, but we can draw too many like close correlations. I kind of gave that comical example of you're gonna have a baby, like there are people who really, like that's really what they kind of think it means. Or there's often, I think sometimes it also depends on whether you are interpreting the card as representing the querent of the card, or yourself if you're reading for yourself, or an aspect of yourself, or a relationship with another person. It can be any of those things, but I think sometimes people limit themselves and think it is only one of those things, and so they may be not catching these other qualities or nuances to be able to think about.
I think one thing that's interesting about the tarot is that someone who doesn't know the cards at all could pick it up and start reading with it. There's something that gets brought up within you. Things start to sort of flow in a way that just speaks to the deep nature of the psyche itself and its ability to weave a narrative and to recognize these universal, powerful symbols. And so even though someone might pick up the Empress and be kind of reading it in a way that I wouldn't agree with, there might still be something there, because when someone speaks about the card, it's a revelation of their own inner aspects and their own inner language and the way the tarot speaks to them, as Matt was saying. But with that said, I do think I agree with Matt in the way that the cards can be approached in a way that's lacking some of that nuance, or maybe you're just like totally off because you don't understand what the Empress means at all. But does it strike something within you then, even if it's wrong? Like then it doesn't matter, right? Like it's done something for you. It's moved something, you've tapped into it. So messing up and getting it wrong is just like part of the game. It's part of learning. It's part of building a relationship with the cards. And I'm always really supportive of people just sort of finding their path and finding their way through, which might, look different than mine, but who's to say I wouldn't get as equally a powerful reading, through their interpretation.
It's interesting to talk about the misinterpretation, because in the Book of Thoth, Crowley says that this card, above all the others, is one where you can't get caught up on any one given part. You need to pay attention to the whole of the card. And I think it speaks to the Freudian element of it, because it is very easy to read it as your mother and not the mother, and not mothers in general. And I'm sure the same can occur when giving a reading. When the person sees that, and that's why it would be, am I having a baby? Because it's that, that's their mother coming out in the reading. So I suppose that, that might be an element that can lead to misinterpretation, is when you let your mother leap into this mother.
All right, we're about at the top of the hour, so we're going to close things out. Thanks to Chris, thanks to Matt, of course, for sharing their wisdom with us. And this series hopefully will continue next month with the Emperor. And we have an upcoming workshop coming up at the Golden Shadow, Alchemy, the 4 elements. That's going to be on Saturday, July 24th at 12 p.m. Pacific time. You can register for that at goldenshadow.org. Thank you everyone for coming, and we hope to see you next time. If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up to date with our projects, attend one of our live events, or work one-on-one with myself or Arran, head to www.goldenshadow.org.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.